to be a great thinker, you have to be pretty spontaneous about it. That's something of what good talking is all about, isn't it? Being able to think on your feet. Herman called smart people picture writers, which you can rightly assume he meant for himself. He said, people have picture writers to always help them put new images and new messages into the equation, into their visual picture of a flow of ideas. The picture that is always being drawn that is already being drawn in their heads when the first word is uttered. The picture that is always being drawn in their heads when the first word is uttered. Way to go, Herman. Who cares? I suppose it comes down to being a little more awake, a little more on top of things than the other people around. Like with Herman, if you're the one on top, it's going to make you feel pretty confident. And if you feel so confident, then you'll probably end up talking more than the rest of the people around you, or talking better. Maybe even talking less. It really does depend. From day one, let's say of high school for starters, Herman was always less tired, less drunk, less stoned, less loud and obnoxious than anyone else. Let me read that again. From day one, let's say of high school for starters, Herman was always less tired, less drunk, less stoned, less loud and obnoxious than anyone else. And this despite the fact that his voice is still to this day the loudest voice in my head. And despite the fact that I, personally, felt he was the most obnoxious person I'd ever met. In the face of my anger and hatred, I learned to appreciate loud coming from him. Loud when it's done well. He's laughing somewhere if he's reading this. He's laughing somewhere if he's reading this. Plenty loud enough to be heard. And what you were listening to always made you think about life that it never... Try it again. Plenty loud enough to be heard. And what you were listening to always made you think about life enough that it never seemed like a bad loud. You usually felt grateful that he'd spoken the way he had. If he hadn't spoken in his unique, persuasive tone, you might not have heard what he said. And by that time, you'd already be glad you heard it. Jesus, I'm sorry, the last digression was quite weak. Let me start over with something a little more concrete. Let me start over with something a little more concrete. Somewhere along the way, as my understanding of things evolved, I decided that all the obnoxiousness I was feeling when I was with Herman, was coming more from me than it was from him. In parentheses, how's that for a confessional? I've actually come far enough to be able to say that I was more the problem than he was, with him saying all the shit that he said that bothered me so much. In parentheses. Herman was never obnoxious the way dumbasses are obnoxious. Actually, now that I think about it, obnoxious should be a word reserved for dumbasses. The Hermans of the world don't realize how much what they're saying bothers the people they're talking to. I figured this out from listening a little more carefully. Once I started listening more carefully, I guess as we got older, and what he was saying became smarter and smarter every day. I started to lose the very serious resentment that was keeping me from admitting that I ever liked him in the first place. Dumbasses do it on purpose. They say obnoxious things because that's all they know how to do. That's why they're dumbasses. Herman makes people think. That's the difference. Eventually, even if you think what Herman is saying might be obnoxious, you'll think about it a few extra seconds, and then suddenly the words will be so fixed in your head that you'll forget you were even bothered by them. You'll forget that you were even bothered. You'll forget that you were ever bothered by them. The tone of his voice is always just perfect, so that the words kind of hang in your consciousness. And that goes even more for the stuff he wrote down, again, which is the real reason we're here. With the written Herman, it's getting all the therapy without having to listen to the therapist. It's like getting all the therapy without having to listen to the therapist. You get to say his words in your own voice without feeling like you're being lectured. And I wouldn't doubt that Herman thought about all this beforehand. He no doubt realized how much nicer it is to read something than it is to have something read to you, or say it to you for that matter. The tone of his voice was always nearly perfect. Nothing ever got lost in translation from his mind to yours. You might not have gotten it all, but it wasn't because you didn't hear him well, or because his voice had a distracting rasp, or some overly smoothness. His voice, like a well-oiled machine, was designed for leaving words in people's heads. Nobody ever says, "Do you remember what Herman's voice sounded like? Do you remember what Herman's voice sounded like?" Nobody ever says that. First of all, I don't think anyone really can. But anyway, if you're anything like me, they never considered it. They probably just took it for granted. It was more like, "Do you remember what Herman was saying?"